Welcome to the very first online public lecture in the Amsterdam Troy Project. My name is Gert Jan van Wijngaarden and I work at the University of Amsterdam, leading a research group which consists of staff members and students from the Amsterdam Center of Ancient Studies and Archaeology, which has been carrying out excavations at ancient Troy since 2018. Now, our particular focus has been the archaeology of archaeology at Troy. And of course, we also hope to be able to go to Troy this year. However, you will understand that because of the circumstances, this is highly uncertain at the moment, and we will have to take a decision whether to go or not to go within the coming weeks. While we wait for this decision, team members and I thought it a good idea to present to you what we are doing. And the coming weeks, the various team members will present on social media, especially on Instagram, what they are doing. So this online lecture essentially is the first of several online presentations, and there will also be Zoom lectures. So the question is, what is archaeology of archaeology? To my knowledge, this is a new concept, which we are still developing at Troy. I'm not aware that anyone else has specifically applied this approach, so it is good to discuss with you what we mean by it. And the program of what we will be doing is, I will first tell you of archaeology, and the second part will be the question, why Troy? Why is Troy a good site to do this particular research? Thirdly, I will look into our way of working, and then I will finally present to you some of the results of our work. All of this will take about half an hour, I guess, perhaps a bit longer, and afterward there will be the possibility, if you want, to pose us some question. Before I begin, I'll present to you the Amsterdam Troy team of 2020. Not all of these people would actually be going to Troy. Wout Arend and Bart are part of the external experts, but the students Vita, Gabriel, Iris, Myungju, Bojan, Raven and Frauke, and my colleague Jitte and myself would be going to Troy this year. And these excavations are done in cooperation with our Turkish team. It's part of the framework of a larger Turkish project on the site, which is directed by Rustem Aslan. So it's a cooperation between the University of Amsterdam and our Turkish colleagues. And we also cooperate with German colleagues in Tübingen and with American colleagues in Cincinnati. And it will become clear why we cooperate with these particular people. Now, archaeology is both a very old and very young discipline. As far as we know, people have always been interested in the past. Think, for example, of the collecting of Greek sculpture by the Romans, or, as we see here, by the active digging for relics of the saints in the Middle Ages. However, archaeology as a means to understand the past dates back only to the 19th century. Some would perhaps argue already in the 18th century, but systematic excavations have been carried out only since the 19th century, with Giuseppe Fiorelli's excavations at Pompeii being among the first, the well-known site of Pompeii, of course. Now, as a method to understand the past, archaeology has a problem. And it is a problem that all archaeologists are aware of, or should be. And the problem lies in the fact that the type of materials that we excavate may be from the past, but they do not necessarily say much about it. If you excavate a site, it will not tell you which site it is, unless you have inscriptions, but this is not the case for prehistory. If you find a destruction layer, for example, here at Troy, you may be able to date it, and you may be able to tell if it belonged to a war. The destruction was the result of a war, but it will not tell you which war that was. And the difficulty to recognize the Trojan War in at the site of Troy is a result of that archaeological problem which I'm talking about. So the business of archaeology essentially is one of interpretation. To go from archaeological data, mute stones, to knowledge about the past, we need to interpret. And this, of course, is a highly subjective and often contested process, as it is also in many other sciences that we know of. Now, archaeologists have always been aware of this particular problem, and they've actively searched for ways to help them making this step from data to knowledge. And they've done so in two main ways. Firstly, by trying to improve the nature of archaeological data itself. Methods of excavations and archaeological research have developed enormously since the early days. Excavation techniques have been refined, and we now work on a highly controlled, small scale. How and what is collected, for example, is continuously developing. Think of animal bones and shells that used not to be collected, but now are always collected. Also think of the introduction of sieving at archaeological sites. And especially the documentation of what we find has changed enormously with the increasing developments in photography and filming of archaeological finds. So archaeological excavations nowadays are highly varied, interdisciplinary, laboratory-like events. The second way in which archaeologists have tried to improve the interpretative step from data to knowledge is to find help in all kinds of neighboring disciplines. A person such as Heinrich Schliemann, who worked in the 19th century at Troy, used only classical texts to help him interpret, and of course his own common sense. But nowadays, theories and methods from many different disciplines are being brought in to help us interpret our finds. Think of ethnoarchaeology, in which examples from anthropology are used to explain prehistoric remains. Now, what we are trying to do with our project on Archaeology of Archaeology is to look at the relations between the changing methods of archaeological fieldwork and interpretation, and how have changes in archaeological fieldwork influenced archaeological interpretations about Troy, and how has it affected the knowledge that we have about the past, and what is the role of all these elements which are mentioned here in our knowledge on the past. So we are trying to look at the process of archaeology itself and the way it has been contributing to our understanding of history. Okay, so much for the theory. I'm sorry about that. I always get a bit carried away when I talk about it, but now for the fun part. Let's go to Troy. Why would Troy be a good site to carry out the research that I just described? Here you can see the site in a drone photograph that we took last summer. And we believe this is the perfect site to do our research, mostly because Troy, according to us, is a key site in archaeology, in Mediterranean archaeology, but in archaeology as a whole. Now, Troy is, of course, mostly known for its Homeric connections. The Trojan War, the beautiful Helen, the Trojan horse, the wrath of Achilles, etc., etc. Homer gave this city fame, and so did other authors, among whom Virgil, I think, is the most important. Now, because of its fame in classical literature, scholars began to look for Troy already in the 18th century, but it was identified and excavated only from the 19th century onwards, and the first one actually who identified it as ancient Troy was Frank Calvert. And since then, a whole series of excavations have been carried out, each time by renowned scholars and renowned excavators. Most well known, of course, Heinrich Schliemann, who carried out his great excavations from 1870 to 1890, and who was succeeded by Wilhelm Dörpfeld, who continued the work in 1893 and 1894. And then in the 1930s, an American team from Cincinnati University excavated there. And in the 1980s until 2012, a combined German-American team under the leadership of Manfred Korfmann excavated it at the site, and there are current excavations directed by my colleague Rustem Aslan. And so more than 150 years of interrupted but continued excavations. And during each of these excavations, new methods and techniques were introduced. Dürpfeld, for example, brought in architectural analysis. Blegen brought in statistical seriation of pottery, and Korfmann brought in remote sensing and modern geology. And quite a bit has changed over the years. If only you look at the visual documentation. When Calvert started, he made little sketches in a notebook. Schliemann brought artists and engravers who made engravings of finds on the site, and while Dürpfeld introduced photography, later film and color photography were also introduced, and we have a drone flying around the site making multiple photographs at a time, so many that I hardly have the time to look at them all. So much have changed, and it's important to realize that because of the name and fame of Troy, such innovations at Troy were quickly adopted elsewhere. What was first tried out in Troy often was adopted at other archaeological sites. Moreover, the results of all these excavations have been relatively well published. Our own library at the University of Amsterdam has 2.5 shelves of books on Troy, but there's much more. And the German colleagues from Tübingen are still working on the publications of their excavations. So the publications are increasing. Actually, the geography of the site as it is now is to a large extent determined by archaeology more than by ancient habitations. We have an engraving, a picture, a drawing of Franz Kauver, a Swiss architect who drew the site of Troy before it was excavated. It was published in 1820. The actual drawing is somewhat older. And this is a picture of how it looks now. More than 2/3 of the hill that was 100% archaeological remains is gone, and the site is surrounded by dumps from excavations. Here you see another picture from the air. Here is the archaeological site. This is the excavation house from which was built by Carl Blegen. Here we have the horse, made in 1974, so not the original one if it were to be found. And all this is dump from previous excavation material that was there and dumped over the side of the hill to the sides. So there's an enormous amount of dump over the site. So I hope to have convinced you that Troy is ideal for our research. It's a notable site. It has a long excavation history, and it has a stratigraphy of different excavations that we can investigate. So our goal is to understand the relation between research objectives by scholars, archaeological method, and scientific and popular interpretations about Troy. And we've operationalized this goal by asking a number of research questions. How did archaeological documentation develop in the Troy excavations, and how is it related to interpretations about the site? What were formal and informal strategies of documenting and of collecting? What was documented in the field and what was not documented? What was collected and what was not collected? What has been published and what has not been published? These are the questions that we ask, and the idea is to try to answer these questions for all of the main excavation campaigns at Troy. So for the Schliemann campaigns, the Dürpfeld campaigns, the Blegen campaigns, and the Korfmann-Rose campaigns. And we have different sources to help us answering these questions. Of course, we begin by reading everything that has been published on the excavation. The 2.5 shelves that we have in our own library, but the multitude of books and articles which are digitally available and available in various records. But we also have the not published excavation records that were made in the field. And these are scattered. They're partly available at Troy itself. In the dig house, we have various copies of materials, but the notebooks, the diaries from Schliemann and the notebooks from Dürkveld, for example, are in Athens in Greece. The notebooks and field documentation by Carl Blegen, who did research in the 1930s, are in Cincinnati in the USA, and all the documentation of the later German excavations of the 1980s, 1990s, and the early 2000s are available in Tübingen. And so we try to read all these publications and the various notebooks that we have. And we excavate filled in trenches. We specifically look at trenches that have been filled in shortly after they were excavated. And so we re-excavate them and look what was documented at the time and what do we see now. And here you can see part of a trench that was excavated by Carl Blegen in 1936 and immediately refilled afterwards. And we re-excavated it looking for this particular wall, and we can compare the situation as we see it now with the situation that Carl Blegen describes in his notebooks and in his publication. And then we can ask the question, what was documented, what was not documented? Addition, we excavate in the dumps of various excavations. As I said, there are many dumps. Here's a map of the citadel, the map made by German archaeologists in 1994. And all these gray areas that you see here are dumps, so soil that used to be on the archaeological remains itself. And we excavate in these dumps, and at this particular spot, Nina Magdelijns has in 2018 and also partly in 2019 excavated a dump, most probably from the Dürkveld period. And here you can see the stratigraphy in the dump layers of various campaigns, probably of excavation. And this is a small part of the material that came from these dumps. And we will compare this to the material that was published and that was documented in the notebooks. And then we can see what choices were made during these excavations of Dürkveld. Now, of course, this is way too much work for myself to do. All the publications, all the notebooks, all the excavations, and this is where the students come in. All the students who go to Troy adopt a campaign or part of a campaign about which in the spring of that particular year, this year, for example, they try to figure out as much of it about it as possible. And then in the summer, we go to Troy and excavate a particular trench, and they can compare their research to what the written remains of the notebooks and the publications. So if they do their work correctly, I have very little to do at the site. And ideally for each of these campaigns, so for the earlier and later Schliemann campaigns, for the Dürkveld campaigns, for the Blegen campaigns, and for the Tübingen Cincinnati campaigns, we would like to excavate a fill and a dump and compare it to the notebooks and the publications. Now, finally, of course, the question, does it work? Do we indeed get a better understanding of the process of archaeology? And of course, we have to wait until we are finished with the whole research. In this map, you can see the blue spots where we excavated in 2018, the red spots where we excavated in 2019, and the yellow spots where we plan to excavate in 2020 or in any other year that we will be able to go there. And only when we have excavated all these trenches, we can begin to compare the various excavations. But we do indeed get a much better idea about the excavations and the choices that were made, that were behind it. And I will give you an example of the Schliemann campaigns. Now we see here Vita Gerritsen sitting on a little hill that we thought at the time would be a fill that was created by Schliemann. So a part that was already excavated and then refilled. But it turned out to be a section that Schliemann left unexcavated. And so when Vita began to excavate, we immediately found out that this was part of a section that was unexcavated, and the mud brick tiles of mud brick walls were showing in this particular remains. So this was not a fill, it was an unexcavated part. And you can clearly see the mud brick blocks sitting there. Now, mud brick are sun-dried blocks which are still used extensively in Turkey, in the Middle East, and also in parts of Africa. They're sun-dried blocks, so not baked in an oven, and they're laid to dry in the sun, and then they're usually covered over with plaster. And also in antiquity, this was a main type of building material for architecture. Only the foundations of buildings were made of stone. The rest of the building was of mud brick. So this was important building material which could give important clues about how most of the buildings once had looked many thousands of years ago. And here you can see the way this is thought. This is reconstruction from a building at Troy, a stone foundation, and then mud brick superstructure with plaster on top of it. So important building material, yet it is clear that Schliemann threw it all out. On the walls, immediately next to Vita's preserved section, so the area where Schliemann had been excavating, he did not leave any mud brick remains. You can see Vita's excavation here. Our excavation were parts of these walls and also a wall there. And obviously all the mud brick was taken out. So we assumed that Schliemann was unaware of the importance of mud brick as a building material, that he did not care. And this seemed to be confirmed in the later year. In 2019, again, Vita, who focuses on Schliemann and his earlier campaigns, excavated a part of a dump that was made by Schliemann in his earlier campaigns. And this dump too was full with mud brick material. Here you can see some of the mud brick blocks from that trench. So this appeared to confirm the trench of the year before. But then Wout Arensen came along, who was also part of our team and who had carefully read Schliemann's publications and his diaries. And he shows us that Schliemann, at various points in his books and also in his notebooks and his diaries, is interested in mud brick. He is really interested. And in fact, he makes a different type. He talks about it, he writes about it, and he makes a typology of different types of mud brick according to different types of firing. So he was aware it existed, he was aware of the importance, but he did not keep it in place and preserve it. So where we thought that we were understanding the background of what he has been doing, in fact, we have a new question. We have a kind of a paradox. Why did he, even though he realized the importance of this particular material, he did not keep it? And we have to rethink our ideas about Schliemann's methods and ways of thinking all over again. So we are at a loss, and I welcome any one of you who has an idea on this problem to contact me and to help us with it. So I close off. We hope to be able to join our Turkish colleagues in Troy this summer to continue our explorations, to continue this notion of archaeology, which is still in its early station. Even if we will not be able to go to Troy this year, you can all be certain that we continue to work on the research at Troy, and we will be back to finish the research in any other year. And I invite you to contact me in any case of questions, and especially if you have any suggestions, and especially if you have a suggestion to our Schliemann paradox. I thank you very much for your attention.